my dad had the album that came out in 2000 called Number Ones. And Number Ones, for those of you who don't know, it's one of the biggest selling records of the Beatles' career, even though it's a compilation, is the red album cover with the big one in the center, the yellow one. And it's got all of their hits. They had 30 number one hits across a myriad of countries. And the first time I ever heard Love Me Do, which is the Beatles' first single, it comes out in August, I believe, of 1962. And there's 3 recorded versions, one with Pete Best, who is the original drummer for the Beatles on drums. Right. And then there's Ringo Starr's version, obviously. And there's another man whose name I'm blanking on. But the first time I hear that song...
John Lennon?
No, Andy White was the drummer. No, John Lennon was the rhythm guitar player for the Beatles.
All right.
But the first time I heard that, I'm like, Dad, what the hell is this? I'm like... And he's like, oh, it's the Beatles. And so we get home, and he takes me into, we have a downstairs closet in our house, and it's filled with CDs. I mean, my dad was listening to, Scott, you'll find this funny. My dad had TV show theme songs on CDs that he would listen to. But then he showed me these albums. He goes, he'd be like, here's that, and here's that. And he showed me 3 albums that I still adore to this day, because at this point I've heard everything in the Beatles catalog. And I think they're the most important musical act of all time. They're Beethoven in a rock music sense. He showed me Revolver, Help, and he showed me Let It Be, which is the final record that the
Let
Beatles...
It Be, I remember that one.
Which came out in 1970 after they had broken up.
All right, so tell me, have you ever been to Nashville?
I never went to Nashville, though. Nashville's a big country music...
Nashville? Yeah, I know.
Nashville's a big country music hub.
Rogers always a favorite of mine.
Grand Ole Opry and, the likes of...
My sister-in-law lives there.
Johnny Cash and...
country.
I'm a big country music fan, but when my dad showed me the Beatles for the first time, he also showed me these 2 albums that came out in '73, which is called the Red and the Blue album. Right. The Red album, the Beatles' career is 8 years recorded-wise, so it's a perfect chunk of time. So the Red album is 62 to 66. It shows the early Beatles. It's, it's Love Me Do, it's Please Please Me, it's I Saw Her Standing There, it's I Should Have Known Better, or Hard Day's Night from '64, and then... You go to 67 to 70, which is the Blue record, and again, these were fundamental. This is the first time I heard songs like Octopus's Garden, where the Beatles get very psychedelic. Although, go back to 66 and you listen to Revolver, and you listen to a song like I'm Only Sleeping or Taxman, a George Harrison composition, where they're very much embracing the sounds of psychedelia and, feedback guitars, which they first employed on 1964's I Feel Fine. The first song, I believe, other than Link Wray's 1958 single Rumble, to have feedback on a song, on a rock music song, which is very influential given where rock music would go, in the ensuing years, 66, 67, with bands like Cream, Jefferson Airplane, and 13 Floor Elevators for more of a culty psychedelic rock band from Austin, Texas. But, yeah, when my dad first showed me those records and he played them in the car, I think my obsession with Elvis was kind of superseded by the Beatles. And then he showed me Led Zeppelin. I'll never forget when I was 10 years old for Christmas, or 11. He bought me an album called Mothership, and this is 2007. Led Zeppelin had just gotten back together. And again, this episode is our musical journey, so I'm just, giving you my trajectory with music. Okay. And, with the Beatles and Elvis, I had touched spheres of music from doo-wop to rockabilly to country music to early rock and roll to a little bit of psychedelic rock, which psychedelic rock is something that's still very much that I listen to nowadays with modern bands like Tame Impala and, listening to a lot of the 60s stuff like the Byrds, who would also further embrace country music. You listen to an album like Sweethearts of the Rodeo, another album I'd highly recommend, recorded in Nashville, by the way.
Well, my dad has always been a doo-wop kind of guy. And being from the Motor City, you got to understand, too, that...
Motown.
Right, exactly. So I've been brought up in a town like Motown, and obviously the Jackson 5 was big, Diana Ross, Supreme, Aretha Franklin, Detroit doesn't really...
I agree with you.
Detroit does not really get the recognition that it should, but back then, you had the Motown sound, which struck a certain era at a certain time. They have a place, I've never been to it. Well, one day maybe I'll get there. Called Hitsville, USA. Mm-hmm. Never been there. Maybe one day I will. Too much family, hard to get to them, and it probably you really laugh your tail off. I've never been to Henry Ford Museum either.
No, I've never been to Michigan
Village either. So, and yet I live there. But it just depends on what you're into. But when you look at the different geographic areas, then many of them have their own identity from a music standpoint. Listen, for whatever it's worth, Chicago is known for comedy. New York is Broadway. Are there a lot of musicals that?
Yeah,
you bet.
And New York is also known for, and Detroit too. And I'll give you guys this city credit. Not many people realize this, but I mean, there's a myriad of great, Motown and soul artists from Detroit. Obviously, Stevie Wonder, Tammy Terrell, and Marvin Gaye, the Jackson 5, who would get their start with Diana Ross in the late '60s. Their first album was actually called Diana Ross Presents the Jackson 5.
Right.
But punk music, and I know you think it's noise, but a lot of the proto-punk bands and bands that would come to define the sound of punk rock actually spawned from Detroit, and hip-hop too, in the 80s, and Detroit, and techno music, which, I mean, it's a city that doesn't get enough credit. But there was two bands in particular from Detroit that were absolutely they're very important in the grand scheme of punk music and experimental rock, and just where in directions rock music would go that would kind of go off the path of very much commercial mainstream. And that's the Stooges, and that's a band called Death. Right. The Stooges, obviously led by Iggy Pop, Ron Ashton. But musical scenes are something that we'll further touch on as we do more episodes of this show. And, I'd like to do maybe an episode dedicated to a city and we talk about artists from those areas. I think that'd be pretty cool. But, and we got about 10 minutes left here. But again, with my dad and Led Zeppelin, he bought me this album Mothership, and this is '07. Like I said, Zeppelin had just done the reunion at the O2 for Ahmet Ertegun, who was the co-founder of Atlantic Records back in the 1950s. And he bought me Mothership, which is a compilation released at the time. And my dad, we were driving in the car, and I'm like, hey, can we play this? And he's like, sure. And the first song that came on was Good Times, Bad Times, which is actually the debut song off of Led Zeppelin's self-titled debut album in '69. It's got the German Zeppelin that went down in 1937. Right. And I was like, what? I'm like, what the hell is this? And I had that kind of same epiphany kind of moment. I was just like something triggered in my brain that wasn't active before. Right. I was like, I had never heard a guitar play that way, and I never heard a bass line played via John Paul Jones that struck me that way. And my dad's like, oh yeah, this is the CD I bought you. This is Led Zeppelin, Good Times, Bad Times. And then the next song comes on, and it's Communication Breakdown, which is another very important song in the history of punk music. Then it was known as proto-punk. So you had bands like, that would later into the Stooges and Death, and in New York, the Patti Smith Group and Television. A lot of very bands that would embrace sounds of rock music, like I said, that we hadn't seen before, like with the Beach Boys. The Beach Boys were embracing orchestral arrangements via Brian Wilson's, Ear for the Wall of Sound and Phil Spector. But listening to Zeppelin and artists that my dad grew up listening to, but again, his tastes were more seeped in, doo-wop and soul and rock and early rock and roll and a little bit of country music. I was like, and I'm 11 years old, so it's the perfect time for this. I'm a preteen. I'm like, I'm gonna start rebelling against my parents. So I delved into everything, and I being that the kind of person I am, I have to impulsively search something. I would go on Wikipedia, and I read about Led Zeppelin. I read about how they broke up in 1980 when John Bonham dies of alcohol poisoning. Right. He drank 16 gin and tonics or something. I don't remember exactly, or vodka tonics, and then he died, and then they broke up after that. And I was like, and then I discovered other bands in this category. Blue Cheer from San Francisco, Black Sabbath, obviously from Birmingham, the same place that Judas Priest hailed from. And then I just further went down this road of heavy metal. In fifth grade, really, as we near the wrap up of this, fifth grade, I think, is the most important part of my musical development as far as my tastes go. I was still listening to stuff obviously Elvis was still there. But after I had discovered the Beatles and Zeppelin, then I would get into Alice Cooper, a lot of the shock rock stuff of the 70s, early Kiss, even though now I think Kiss, they're a despised band, even though they have a song named after your city's sake, Detroit Rock City from 1976's Destroyer. Right. I would listen to bands like that. I just immersed myself in the realms of hard rock and heavy metal. And AC/DC, a band who was actually my first concert in December of 2008 when I was in sixth grade. And from there, it kind of just spawned, this was my new thing. It was rock music and rock music only. I mean, I wouldn't embrace hip-hop until I got into 7th and 8th grade. But, then I got into bands like Nirvana, grunge, Seattle. If you want to talk about Seattle, probably a city that we'll later touch on the sound from there. And I would just, from there, I kind of just spawned off into other things. And then I get into high school and I'm listening to my freshman year of high school, I'm listening to folk music. I'm listening to Pink Floyd and a lot of the progressive rock stuff, King Crimson. And I think the point of this episode more, not only did I want to give the listeners and just an idea of where me and Scott come from musically, and Scott, obviously a very territorial thing. He was lucky enough to get to grow up in that time period. Right. Is that music, regardless of era, is going to hit you at different times. You just have to be exposed to it. And I think, what's really amazing about sports is the same thing that can be said about music, and that's this universality thing that I'm trying to talk about, is when your favorite team wins a championship. I mean, I'll give you an example. How happy were you when the Detroit Tigers won the 1968 World Series? You're elated, right?
Oh, yeah.
The same thing happens to me whenever I hear a song off of a Beach Boys single from '65 called California Girls.
Right.
I'm immediately hit with this euphoria. Because obviously it's the arrangement. It's Leon Russell, the session player for the Wrecking Crew, who's playing, I believe he's playing Hammond organ on that song. And
right.
the vocal harmonies via Brian, Mike Love, and Carl Wilson, and everybody in the Beach Boys. Bruce Johnston, who had joined the Beach Boys at that time. It's like with sports, music can hit you with this sense of euphoria, but then at the same time, and the last point I'll make, it can hit you with a profound sense of sadness. The same thing when your team loses a big game, or you get heartbroken. Music can be that Band-Aid that kind of heals that for a short period of time.
Yeah, there was one point I want to bring out. Last night on The Real and the Rare with Xavier McKnight and I, we use music in a different sense. For those of you that have ever heard the song Concrete Angel, it's sung by Martina McBride, and it talks about child abuse. And I think it's important that when you have an opportunity to listen to different songs, that there are strong messages that are related through music in every way, shape, or form. And for those of you people that ever get a chance to listen to Concrete Angel, you should, okay, because we have to address societal issues, and sometimes music and genre is a good way to do it. And I'm glad that Xavier McKnight and I last night on the program took it upon ourselves to do that. So as you and I continue to uncover different things to make these programs more interesting, whether it's an era, whatever your reasons are for embracing music are what they are, and they're all based on individual taste, whether it's to send a message about what's bad in society, like child abuse, why I need it for meditation purposes. Okay, you can never, taking long drives or just a celebratory thing with sports or whatever. It doesn't matter, because the one thing that you can always find consistent with music is in most cases it's always a release of some sort, every way, shape, or form. And as we go ahead and do this more often, I'm sure we'll uncover different things. And we also encourage any kind of feedback here. If you're looking to give us feedback about this, feel free to write us at southfloridatribune@gmail.com. And you are listening to the South Florida Tribune podcast with Scott Morganroth and
Louis Addeo-Weiss. And I'm going to leave on this, and this is something I want to make a theme, should these episodes become a regular thing, and it's for our listeners. I know most of our viewership comes via the sports fans, right? But I want to leave people with this. If there's, at the end of each show, what I'm going to do, and I don't expect Scott to do it because, he listens to music in a far different way than I do. I like to absorb albums, and I like stories behind them. I'm going to recommend 3 albums for anybody on this show to listen to. And if we start doing like regional things, if we start doing episodes surrounding cities, which I'll do research for, and I'll bring prior knowledge in and we'll discuss them. I'm going to recommend 3 albums that anybody should listen to. And of the albums that we discussed today, 3 albums that I recommend anybody here should listen to as we close up is the Beach Boys' Pet Sounds. And I'll give you an early era Beach Boys record that you can listen to too. Listen to an album such as Shut Down Volume 2, which has a very beautiful song on it that you should listen to called Don't Worry Baby. Beautiful, beautiful arrangement, very much in the realm of something Phil Spector was doing at the time with the Ronettes and the Shirelles. And then the last song that I'll recommend that you listen, or last record that I recommend you listen to, is it'd have to be Miles Davis, Bitches Brew, because Scott mentioned his affinity for Chicago, and a group whose early work is very much rooted in jazz fusion and the influence of jazz and the meshing with rock music. That record is a perfect culmination of that, whether it's John McLaughlin's guitar, Chick Corea, and Joel Zawiney, who would go on later in the next year, in 1971, to form a group called Weather Report, an amazing jazz fusion group that would feature Jaco Pastorius, who actually passed away in Fort Lauderdale in 1987. Great electric bass player. Bitches Brew would be another record that I'd recommend you guys listen to, because not only is that record amazing in the scheme of Miles Davis's career, but it's one of the most influential records of all time. And with that, I'll say goodbye. Scott, you have any other words before we go?
Well, I'm looking forward to going ahead and doing these music shows, because, again, to me, it's a subject that doesn't get enough attention. And as we look for more and more music to play within the network, just so you know, we have 5 current shows right now. and I don't know how many more we'll really add to it. But we want to make sure that whatever music we have that Louis will be in charge of setting up will be appropriate to all the content related to what we're doing. So this is something I'm definitely looking forward to doing. I'm glad that this is a passion that you have of yours, and I'm certainly looking forward to being more involved with it as well as time progresses.
And if there's one more thing I want to leave you with, I think one big thing I want to take away from you is not only opening other people's eyes up to music that they haven't heard before that may really affect them in some kind of way, but good or bad emotionally, is I kind of want you to immerse yourself more with some of this music whenever you have the time. You know, you can just pull up YouTube and listen to a song here or there. If I can get you to hear the Beach Boys' God Only